So this past weekend, I suffered through the game that is Blair Witch, and right now I'm going to give my impressions on it. Now, I went into this with a fairly open mind. I had heard very conflicting things about this game. Number one, a lot of people were saying that, it wasn't that good and that it was sort of a very long, drawn out, boring survival horror game that really wasn't scary, to be quite honest. And then a lot of other people were saying, no, it was quite interesting, a very good atmospheric game and that you should give it a shot. So naturally, this is one of the games on my backlog and people had voted for it when I put up the poll on Twitter. And I went into it with a fairly open mind, not really expecting anything and not really just knowing that some people felt conflicted on it, not knowing much else, to be quite honest. And I immediately when I started up this game, I knew there was something wrong here. Now let me explain. I played this game on the Xbox One X for reference. Okay, this game was advertised by Microsoft and announced at the Microsoft press conference, I believe at E3 2018, if I'm remembering correctly. And so I bought the game originally on the Xbox store and had played it on the Xbox One X. I immediately knew something was wrong when I booted up the game and started playing it, all right? This game has probably one of the worst frame rates, if not the worst frame rate I have ever seen for a game this generation. In fact, it's probably up there in the top 5 most worst performing games. And I can't for the life of me figure out why, other than the game is simply unoptimized and they made poor choices. You're looking at gameplay right now on your screen. You're probably saying to yourself, wow, this looks choppy. What's wrong with the video? Did you render it? Did you have issues rendering it? Or, something is up here. The game is stuttering like crazy. And no, that's the game. The game literally stutters like crazy when you're doing nothing but just walking around. There's no crazy effects. There's no big, huge explosions. It's not like this game is like Doom and you have a huge, beautiful ballet of effects and particles in your face 24/7 during you playing the game. This is just a very atmospheric, sort of investigative and somewhat slow-paced survival horror game, and I can't for the life of me figure out why this game is giving me issues with performance, other than the developers just simply didn't optimize their code. And this game had come out, in August of 2019, I believe, or September 2019, one of those months, and so it's been out for a while, 6 months, so if there was issues with this game, I would surely think that they would have had time to patch this out, but no, this is the state of the game as of me playing it in March 2020, and it's terrible, absolutely terrible. There is major technical issues with this game. The frame rate and the frame time specifically are completely just wavering and going at any pace they want to go at. And this game runs at a native 4K resolution on the Xbox One X, and I just can't fathom the developers of this game looking at this and saying, yep, this is perfectly fine, and shipping the game this way, but they did. Listen, the Xbox One X is super powerful, right? It's a great console. But for some reason with this game, I have never heard the fans ramp up to the noise levels that they did when I was playing this game with any other game. I mean, I have played some really crazy, graphically intensive games. Red Dead Redemption 2, full 4K on the X. Metro Exodus, full 4K on the X. These are native 4K games with humongous worlds and tons of graphical fidelity. And these games run like a dream on that console with minimal to perceptibly zero dips in frame rate whatsoever, and tons of beautiful effects like real-time reflections and beautiful dynamic time of day and dynamic weather and all this shit. And this is the game that ramps up the fans on my Xbox console running at the same resolution and can't even consistently hit a solid frame rate. It is embarrassing, and if I didn't have such a if I wasn't so persistent in my want of trying to beat everything that I own and everything like that, I would have dropped this immediately within the first 15 minutes of playing, because it doesn't get any better. It doesn't improve. The frame rate doesn't get any more solid. It stays like this consistently throughout the experience. And I don't even know, because they released the game later on the PlayStation 4. I don't even know if the game performs like that on that platform. And I can't even imagine if the X can't even run this game fluidly. I can't even fathom what the experience is like on the original base Xbox One. It must be unplayable. So right off the bat, that was just immediately apparent to me. Now, in terms of the visuals, again, this game runs at a native 4K resolution on the X. It's clean. It's a clean looking game. They use a temporal anti-aliasing solution, so you don't see a lot of jagged edges. It's a clean looking game, right? And the graphics are inconsistent. Some parts of the game look really nice. They use screen space shadows to give depth to the foreground objects. This is a similar effect that they used in Days Gone that I played recently, right? So you'll look at like the foreground and just objects on the ground and the leaves and everything like that, and there's these gorgeous tons of contact shadows, that really help elevate the texture work and the terrain in the game. So there are parts of the game that look absolutely stunning, but then there are other parts that have such muddy textures that looks like it came from like the early 360 era, and I just don't know. It's so weird, Character models look decent. Your actual dog, which is a companion of yours that you have to use to help solve some puzzles as well as figure out where to go and things like that. The dog looks pretty good. You actually have a customization with the dog, so you can actually choose different colors of fur, different colors of the eye, and different colored collars as well. So you have some slight customization there. So the graphics are sort of hit or miss. The game uses this really odd always on depth of field effect, which blurs sort of distant objects. Now, I like depth of field as an effect. I think it looks very great, especially when it's used in a very filmic like scene, where you're sort of looking at a character and they sort of blur out the background. I think that depth of field is a great effect. However, in this game specifically, I think it hurts the visuals more than it enhances it. It doesn't look nice. It's a very low quality depth of field effect, and so a lot of times it will sort of defocus and focus on the wrong thing, and it's just not a very pleasant effect to look at. Like I said, I think it hurts the experience more than it actually improves it. This game also supports HDR10, and it is the most useless form of HDR10 I have ever seen in a video game, at least to recent that comes to mind. It does nothing. The game's color palette is so monotone, so desaturated, that I saw no evidence of an expanded color gamut whatsoever. And what's interesting is that in this video, I actually had to increase the saturation of colors and hues to actually get this game to look somewhat appealing. But HDR is completely worthless here. Everything looks the same, no matter what. And you would think, okay, there's not an expanded color gamut because that's the art style of the game. They're going for a very gray, desaturated, sort of noirish type of style with the color. All right, I get that. It's a lot of foggy atmosphere. You're in the forest, so it's sort of desaturated. There's a lot of fog. It's very dark at times. What about the highlights? Completely useless here. Your flashlight looks at times as if you're holding a candle instead of a flashlight, and the candlelight in Red Dead Redemption 2 was brighter and more punchier than the actual electronic flashlight from not only the flashlight you're carrying with batteries, right, but your cell phone as well. It does not improve whatsoever the experience, and it is completely useless HDR10. The only time that HDR has actually had some form of impact to me is this one scene where lightning strikes and it actually helps illuminate the environment around you. That is the only instance where I was actually like, okay, I'm getting some form of expanded highlights here. And then the only other instance that comes to mind is that when you're actually fighting the monsters, quote unquote, in this game, which are really just particle effects. This is the most hilarious thing about this game, is that it thinks it's scary, but you don't know what's out there. You're essentially you have no way of attacking the enemies, but to kill the enemies in this game, you have to spin around in 360 degrees as fast as you can until your flashlight illuminates brighter and then flashes at the monsters, which really just look like particle effects and a bunch of twigs put together. It's the most pathetic thing I've ever seen, right? And your flashlights gets brighter, so you get a little bit of more, I would assume, a more punchy light brightness from the flashlight with HDR10 enabled. But again, it's so sparingly used, so you're not really seeing any benefit here whatsoever. And I think the concept here is well done. You know, I don't want to sit here and bag on the game constantly, all right? The game does well at a few things, and that is sort of the intriguing story that's going on. And this game is called Blair Witch, but it's not really about I mean, there's an underlying story that could have been present without this whole witchcraft and psychological manipulation and issues and stuff. You know, there's other things that could have they could have made a story and not called it Blair Witch, and it would have been perfectly fine standalone. So I don't really know why it's called Blair Witch. I haven't seen the movie itself, so maybe a lot of people are going to say, oh, well, you know, you don't have any frame of reference, but Blair Witch has sort of always been like this, all right? So I'm not really sure what it's, in terms of what it's based on. I've never seen the movie. I've only remember vaguely about it, hearing about it back in the day, you know, when they filmed that. What was it, the mid 2000s or so, whenever that came out. So I don't know much about it to actually sit here and say, all right, it does the film justice. But all I can tell you is that there's no real conclusion or sensible explanation to why the paranormal stuff is happening in the game, other than your character's fucking crazy. But this is sort of a side plot that's happening alongside the paranormal stuff that's happening, so it's not really like it's connected at all. It's very bizarre. You're gonna find yourself intrigued at some points throughout the story, but the overall underlying story sort of leaves this vague open-endedness that you're just supposed to use your imagination in order to figure out. And it's not really well done. It's not a reason to play the game. So with the story sort of out of the way, and with the graphics as inconsistent as they are, what else is left? Well, I think the game's soundtrack is actually somewhat good. I like it. It's more sort of muted, but it has like that nice sort of bassy tone to it, and it sort of leaves you it sort of feels cinematic in a sense, like it does actually come from a film and whatnot. So they did a good job with the soundtrack. I think the actual voice acting is somewhat inconsistent. At times the character sort of, you know, reacts appropriately. At other times it's sort of like, okay, are we looking at the same thing? Are we in the same situation? So again, it could be sort of hit or miss there. One thing I do have to say about the game that I really liked is its actual gameplay investigation elements. So the game has some really cool elements where you'll find video cassette tapes, because this is supposed to be, I guess, the late 90s. Or wherever. Again, I'm not sure when that movie was created, so I have no frame of reference, but the guy's using like an old Nokia phone, so I take it it's supposed to be the mid to late 90s in the game. And so you find these video cassette tapes that you put in your camcorder, and you're supposed to rewind the cassette tapes to actually manipulate the world that you're in. This is interesting stuff. And so you'll come across a path that's blocked, maybe a tree, blocked your way and you can't progress forward. And so you find these cassette tapes, you rewind the footage back to the point where the tree was actually standing and didn't fall, and you then put the camcorder away, and all of a sudden the world's changed. You've now manipulated reality to the point where you can progress forward. Again, there's no logical explanation for this in the narrative, so it sort of fails in terms of it making sense, but it's an interesting gameplay dynamic. This is the good stuff about this game. You got a really nice soundtrack, you got really interesting investigative gameplay, but that's about it. There is nothing else here besides those two elements that is worthwhile. With a game that isn't really scary, half the time you can't see where the fuck you're going because it's so fucking dark. And I don't know if the HDR is actually, hurting me, hurting the experience overall, because I swear to you, I couldn't see jack shit in the world. And I had the brightness set appropriately. The game has a brightness adjustment, which I set appropriately up to the game's recommendations of where it should be. I had HDR10 enabled, which again didn't do jack shit. I couldn't figure out where the fuck I was going half the time. Most of the time I was running into walls, running into dead ends, and I couldn't figure out where I needed to go. And I believe I had to look up twice on a YouTube video exactly where I needed to go in order to actually progress forward, because it's so fucking dark. You can't see from either side of you, and your flashlight again is pointless. This is where HDR would have helped. It would have helped illuminate the brightness from the flashlight so you can actually see where the fuck you're going. But they failed at this. This is a really frustrating experience, I do have to say. And I felt that the conclusion, the game sort of redeems itself at the end, or it really tries, as it ramps things up, as things start to become more twisted, much more interesting, much more paranormal. There are some actually good moments towards the end of this game, as the game starts to explain more about the underlying elements of the character background as well as the narrative. But again, it sort of fails and drops because they have this super long, drawn out section towards the end of the game, which takes, it's so oddly paced. It takes like 20 to 25 minutes of you just sneaking around, which is not really sneaking around because the game wants you to stare at the floor the whole time in order to progress through the game. Essentially, they used what I call the daylight effect. You guys may remember at the launch of the PS4 in 2014, mid-2014, that launch year, there was a survival horror game that came out called Daylight. I think I reviewed this game on the channel back in the day. This game was more frustrating than it was scary, and that's what Blair Witch reminded me of, because in that game, if you looked at the enemies, you would get hurt. So all you had to do in that game was turn the camera around and walk backwards, and you can literally play through the entire game, and beat the entire game just running through the levels, but backwards. It's sort of the same thing with this game. You get hurt if you look at the enemies. And so what they make you do is stare at the ground, and it sort of illuminates this path that goes through the world. It's completely pathetic, and you have to do this for a 20 to 30 minute segment towards the end of the game. It's so long, drawn out, and it's completely frustrating because you're just like, oh, let's get this over with. And it's such a shame, because I feel like the elements that this game does really well, again, the investigative part, the sound design and everything, really good sound design, and they have these, again, these flashback moments of this character and where he come from, and they sort of explain why he has these psychological issues, right? And there's these moments where sort of his past sort of mixes with his current reality. And so you have these, large screeching sounds that I felt like I was going to blow my speaker, and I didn't have the game that loud, to be quite honest with you, right? But the sound design, like these things come screeching at you. I don't want to explain what they are, right? Because if you are going to play the game, it is a quite, scary moment when that happens. This game does have a few jump scares, right? But they use sound to a really good degree in this game. And like I said, the investigation's really good. But besides that, you're going to be met with technical issues at nearly every single turn. That stuttering did not go away throughout the entire experience. I cannot for the life of me fathom why they shipped the game this way, and why after 6 months plus of the game being out there on the market, this is not fixed. If the world's most powerful console can't run this game, then what can? They just announced that they're going to be moving this game over to the Nintendo Switch. At what, 10 frames per second? like how are they gonna optimize this game to actually be somewhat playable on that system if they can't even optimize it for the most powerful console on the market? It just makes no sense. Reduce the resolution, for God's sakes. I don't need fucking 4K in this game. It really does nothing, just like your HDR presentation does nothing. I don't know why it's in the game. Like these effects are meant to enhance the visuals. They're meant to enhance the experience. Instead, I feel like they hurt the experience because things are too fucking dark and you can't see anything. And, your frame rate is a stuttery mess that I don't care how sharp the visuals are. I can't play your fucking game. So I'm just met with this frustration at every single turn when I was playing this game, and it wasn't that scary, to be quite honest with you. It had some jump scare moments, but they were few and far in between, and the game attempts to redeem itself towards the end, but sort of fails at that because it's long, overdrawn segments of you sneaking around enemies. So honestly, this is a skip for me. I was very disappointed when I played this game. I really thought this was going to be a good one. And, I always go into games with an open mind. I don't like to go in here with this preconceived thought of, well, everyone hated the game, so this is supposed to be a crap fest. I don't read reviews anymore for games. I'll check out maybe one review and I'll see what people think on Twitter, because people always post their reviews on Twitter and they post like the first sentence or two of their written article. And that's basically what I get from hearing about reviews. People will generally tell me as well, like, oh yeah, it didn't really score that well, but I always go into games fresh with an open mind, and I play a lot of shit, so for me, I have much more patience than I think the general casual person who's jumping in to play this game every once in a while. But let me tell you something, skip this. I didn't find it worthwhile whatsoever. I think that the gameplay of this game are elements that they can improve upon, but that's only if they will improve upon it. I don't know how this game did in terms of its sales, but it's really not that great of an experience. And there's so many technical issues. There's so many other issues with the game that you'll end up just feeling frustrated rather than, scared and really invested. And that's such a shame, because there are really good elements of this game at times, but they're just so few and far between these other technical hiccups. So that's it. That's what I think of Blair Witch. For those of you who have played it, do you agree? Do you disagree? Let me know, and we will talk later. All right. Thanks.